May 26, 1941. Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, Louisiana. Commander Ross Daggett from the Navy Bureau of Ships stood at the water's edge, his arms crossed tightly across his chest as he watched a peculiar plywood boat slam repeatedly into the concrete seawall. The hull shuddered with each impact, then reversed, spun almost within its own length, and charged the wall again. Behind him, Major Ernest Linsert of the Marine Corps Equipment Board scribbled notes with increasing urgency. They had come to witness what the Navy brass in Washington had dismissed as the fantasy of a brawling Irishman with more mouth than sense. What they were about to see would change the course of the Second World War. The man orchestrating this violent ballet was Andrew Jackson Higgins, and he was demonstrating a boat with a feature so radical that Navy engineers had spent 20 years failing to achieve it. A simple steel ramp on the bow that could drop down and allow men and vehicles to charge directly onto a beach. In 4 years, this plywood ramp would land more Allied soldiers on hostile shores than all other methods combined. Without it, Dwight Eisenhower would later reflect in 1964, the Allied strategy for winning the war would have been impossible. The origins of this moment began not in triumph, but in failure. In 1931, the lumber export company owned by Andrew Jackson Higgins entered voluntary receivership during the Great Depression. The businessman from Nebraska had built a fleet of sailing ships to transport hardwood from the Philippines and Central America, constructing his own shipyard to service them. When global trade evaporated, both A.J. Higgins Lumber and Export Company and Higgins Industries were placed into voluntary receivership, with a friendly judge appointing Higgins as his own receiver. Higgins found himself with a boatyard, mounting debts, and a stubborn refusal to quit. He had learned boat design during a brief stint in the Nebraska National Guard and perfected it through necessity in the Louisiana bayous. The shallow marshes and debris-choked waterways of the Gulf Coast demanded boats that could navigate in 18 inches of water, plough through vegetation, run over submerged logs, and beach themselves on muddy banks without fouling their propellers. Conventional boat designs failed miserably in these conditions. Higgins designed something different. His Eureka boat, developed in 1926 and refined throughout the 1930s, featured innovations that seemed simple but were devastatingly effective. The bow was shaped like a spoon, allowing it to ride up onto obstacles rather than ploughing into them. A solid pine block called the head log reinforced the bow, making it the strongest part of the boat capable of absorbing tremendous impacts. The hull design was revolutionary. A deep V-shape at the front transitioned to a reverse curve amidships, then flattened into planning surfaces at the rear. This created aerated water flow that reduced friction and increased speed. Most crucially, Higgins built a semi-tunnel into the hull that protected the propeller and drive shaft. The boat could run full speed into a beach, the propeller safely recessed, then reverse off without damage. Oil drillers bought them for accessing remote drilling sites. Trappers used them in the marshes. Bootleggers, during Prohibition's final years, appreciated their speed and shallow draft for rum-running operations. The boats performed reliably, and Higgins kept his small operation alive through the Depression by building them one at a time. Through ingenuity and determination, Higgins created Boat Services Company in 1931, a third business that purchased craft from Higgins Industries and leased or sold them to others. This arrangement allowed him to keep nearly 50 people employed. By 1935, he had paid off his debts and maintained solvency while other businesses collapsed around him. In 1937, halfway around the world, events were unfolding that would eventually bring the U.S. military to Higgins's door. Japanese forces were invading China, and American military observers were watching closely. Lieutenant Victor Krulak of the U.S. Marine Corps stood on a Shanghai rooftop in the summer of 1937 with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens. Below him, Japanese troops were conducting amphibious landings during the Battle of Shanghai, using boats unlike anything in the American arsenal. These Japanese Daihatsu-class landing craft had a simple but brilliant feature: a bow ramp that dropped down, allowing troops and equipment to charge directly onto the beach rather than climbing over the sides while under fire. Krulak took photographs and sent them back to Washington with a detailed report titled Japanese Assault Boats, Shanghai, 1937. His superiors filed it away with a notation dismissing it as the work of some nut out in China. The US military in the late 1930s was ill-prepared for amphibious warfare, despite the Marine Corps' growing conviction that such operations would be essential in any coming war. The Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair had been tasked with developing landing craft, but had produced designs that were, in Higgins' later assessment, worthless. When the Navy held competitive trials for landing craft designs in 1938, Higgins was not invited. He learned about the tests only after every submitted design had failed. The Marine Corps, frustrated with the Navy's inability to produce a workable landing craft, remembered the strange boats they had heard about from the Coast Guard, who had purchased several Eureka boats for rescue operations. They contacted Higgins directly, bypassing the Navy's procurement system. In 1938, Higgins brought his Eureka boat to Norfolk, Virginia, for Navy and Marine Corps testing. The trials were a revelation. The Higgins boat outperformed every Navy design, running up onto beaches at full speed, reversing off cleanly, turning in impossibly tight circles, and maintaining speed in shallow water where Navy boats wallowed. During fleet landing exercises in February 1939, Marine officers watched with growing excitement as the Eureka boats performed flawlessly in conditions that would have destroyed conventional craft. The boat's shallow draft allowed it to operate in waters where other vessels grounded helplessly. The protected propeller meant it could beach and reverse without fouling. The spoon-shaped bow absorbed impacts that would have stove in traditional hulls. The Navy brass in Washington remained deeply skeptical. The Bureau of Ships had invested years in their own designs and viewed this civilian boat builder from the swamps as an upstart intruding on their territory. The Navy represented the clubby world of Eastern shipbuilding giants with established contracts and political connections. Higgins, with his profanity-laced vocabulary and aggressive personality, was decidedly not part of that club. In a moment that would become legendary, Higgins travelled to Washington and visited the Bureau of Ships. When shown the Navy's landing craft blueprints, he took a pencil and scrawled across them, "This boat stinks. AJH." The Navy officers were not amused by this brash civilian's assessment of years of their engineering work. But after their designs continued to fail in tests while Higgins's boats succeeded, they had no choice. In 1939, the Navy reluctantly ordered Higgins to build landing craft based on his Eureka design. These were designated landing craft, personnel, or LCP. They could carry troops to shore effectively, but they had one critical flaw that Marine officers recognized immediately. Soldiers had to climb over the sides to disembark, exposing them to enemy fire and making unloading slow and dangerous. Men laden with 60 pounds of equipment struggled to clamber over the gunwales while under fire. In training exercises, the process was cumbersome. In combat, it would be lethal. The Marines knew this was unacceptable, but had no immediate solution to the problem. By April 1941, Victor Krulak had built a balsa wood model of the Japanese landing craft based on his 1937 Shanghai photographs. During a meeting at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, Krulak showed Higgins the model and explained the Japanese design featuring a retractable bow ramp. Higgins examined it for perhaps 30 seconds, his experienced eye immediately grasping the implications. He called his chief engineer on the spot. Within hours, design work had begun. Higgins was not a man who moved slowly when he saw a solution to a problem. At his own expense, without waiting for Navy approval or contracts, he built 3 prototype boats, modifying his proven Eureka design to incorporate a bow ramp. The ramp was steel, reinforced, and could be lowered quickly by a simple mechanical system. When raised, It formed the protective bow of the boat. When lowered, it became a ramp wide enough for men to charge down 4 or 5 abreast, or for a jeep to drive directly onto the beach. The prototypes were ready for testing by late May 1941. Krulak would go on to a distinguished career, rising to lieutenant general and becoming one of the most influential strategists in Marine Corps history. He advocated for helicopter assault tactics that would define amphibious operations in the jet age and wrote First to Fight, an inside view of the U.S. Marine Corps, a classic text on Marine Corps history. He maintained throughout his life that the Higgins boat was the most important tactical innovation of World War II, and he died in 2008 at the age of 95, having witnessed the boats he helped inspire participate in operations from Guadalcanal to the invasions of Iraq. On that pivotal day, May 26, 1941, Commander Daggett and Major Linsert arrived at Lake Pontchartrain to witness demonstrations that would validate or dismiss months of Higgins' work. Higgins demonstrated his boats with characteristic flair and showmanship. He loaded 36 of his employees into one of the boats, simulating a fully loaded combat platoon. The boat roared across the lake at 12 knots, ran directly up onto the shore with the bow lifting slightly, dropped its ramp with a metallic clang, and disgorged all 36 men in seconds. The men charged down the ramp and onto the beach as the boat's engine idled. Then the ramp raised, the boat reversed off the beach smoothly, spun in a tight circle, and repeated the demonstration. Higgins then drove a truck onto the boat, demonstrating the craft's vehicle-carrying capacity. The boat approached the shore again, beached, dropped its ramp, and Higgins drove the truck directly onto shore down the ramp without hesitation. The military observers were stunned. This was exactly what the Marine Corps needed for amphibious assault operations. The Navy Bureau of Ships, however, remained hostile to this outsider who had shown them up repeatedly. They had spent 2 decades trying to develop a tank landing craft and had failed utterly. When Higgins designed and built an effective tank landing craft in 61 hours as a demonstration of what was possible, the Bureau despised him for exposing their inefficiency. But the Marine Corps was insistent. They needed these boats, and they needed them in large numbers immediately. As war with Japan became increasingly likely in late 1941, the Navy finally placed substantial orders for what would become the Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel, or LCVP. The Higgins boat, as it would be universally known by the troops who rode in it, was officially born. The designation would later prove confusing to historians. LCVP referred specifically to the ramped version, distinct from the earlier LCP variants without ramps. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Higgins Industries employed fewer than 75 workers in a single boatyard. The company's net sales in 1937 had been $422,000. Andrew Higgins immediately understood what the attack meant for his business and for America. He began expanding before receiving additional orders, opening new facilities and hiring workers at a pace that stunned observers and violated every conventional business practice. He acquired land near City Park, along the Industrial Canal, and at Michoud in eastern New Orleans. He set up production lines using assembly techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, revolutionary for boat building. Traditional boat construction was a craft, with skilled workers building boats one at a time. Higgins transformed it into mass production, with workers specializing in specific tasks along an assembly line. He hired anyone who could work: white men, black men, women, elderly workers, disabled workers. This was unprecedented in New Orleans and throughout the South. Higgins Industries became the first fully integrated workforce in the city, shattering racial barriers that had existed for generations. All workers were paid equal wages according to their job rating, regardless of race or gender. Black workers and white workers laboured side by side on the same assembly lines, earning the same pay for the same work. Women operated machinery traditionally reserved for men. When criticized by other Southern businessmen who maintained strict segregation, Higgins was characteristically blunt. He attended the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Nashville in April 1941 and made a speech about the rights of African Americans that shocked the business establishment. Eleanor Roosevelt, who attended the conference, called him one of the most enlightened businessmen in America. Higgins' response to critics was direct. He needed workers, and he did not care about their color or gender. He cared whether they could build boats to the exacting standards required to save American lives. The workers responded to his leadership with fierce loyalty and unprecedented production. Higgins installed loudspeaker systems throughout his plants so he could address all workers simultaneously from his office. When special rush jobs came in, he appeared on the factory floor personally, exhorting workers to greater effort with profanity-laced pep talks that somehow inspired rather than offended. Signs hung throughout the facilities with slogans designed to motivate. "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." Workers understood that every boat they built would carry American soldiers into combat. A single defect could mean dozens of deaths. The pressure was immense, but workers took pride in their craftsmanship. They called him Andy, and they meant it with a mixture of affection and respect. When he gave them a 12.5% pay raise in August 1942, he suggested strongly that the increase go into war bonds. The workers complied, subscribing to bonds at 15% of payroll without complaint. By late 1943, Higgins Industries operated 7 manufacturing plants in New Orleans. The workforce had exploded from fewer than 75 in 1938 to more than 25,000 workers by late 1943, though some sources cite 20,000 as the peak figure depending on counting methods across multiple facilities. The company's net sales had grown from $422,000 in 1937 to just over $10 million in 1941 to $144 million in 1944. Higgins had contracts worth $350 million from the US government. The expansion from 75 workers to over 20,000 in 5 years represented one of the most dramatic industrial mobilizations of the war. The 7 plants included facilities on City Park Avenue, St. Charles Avenue, the Industrial Canal, Michoud, Bayou St. John, and in Houma, Louisiana. At peak production, these combined facilities were producing more than 700 boats per month. The Higgins boat itself was deceptively simple in appearance. At just over 36 feet long and under 11 feet wide, it was not large compared to other naval vessels. Powered by a 225-horsepower Grey Marine 671 diesel engine, it could reach 12 knots, though rough seas often reduced this speed considerably. The sides and rear were made of plywood to reduce weight and save strategic steel for other war production. This meant the boats offered limited protection from enemy fire, but it also meant they were light, cheap, and fast to build. The steel bow ramp provided some protection for troops during the final approach to shore. The shallow draft of 3 feet at the rear and 2 feet 2 inches at the front allowed the boat to run directly up onto beaches without grounding. The semi-tunnel protecting the propeller meant it could beach and reverse without fouling on sand, rocks, or debris. A crew of 4 operated each boat: a coxswain who steered and controlled the ramp, an engineer who managed the engine, and 2 crewmen who handled the lines and operated 2 .30-caliber machine guns mounted on either side of the front compartment. The boat could carry 36 fully equipped infantrymen with all their gear, or a jeep and 12 men, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. The genius of the design was not in any single feature, but in how all the features worked together. The shallow draft meant it could approach any beach. The protected propeller meant it could beach without damage. The bow ramp meant troops could disembark quickly under fire. The powerful engine and planning hull meant it could reverse off the beach and return to the transport ships offshore. The entire cycle from approach to landing to extraction could be completed in 3 to 4 minutes. This rapid turnaround meant each boat could make multiple trips per hour, building up forces ashore with remarkable speed. The first combat test of Higgins boats came in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal landings in the Solomon Islands. This was America's first major amphibious operation of the war, and success or failure would influence all future operations. The 1st Marine Division used various Higgins landing craft to assault the beaches. The boats performed even better under combat conditions than in training. They ran up onto the coral beaches, dropped their ramps, and disgorged Marines who charged directly into the jungle. The boats reversed off without difficulty despite the coral, returned to the transport ships, and began ferrying supplies. Within days, thousands of Marines and tons of equipment were ashore. The operation succeeded in large part because the Higgins boats functioned exactly as designed. Marine commanders immediately requested more of these boats for future operations. 3 months later, in November 1942, Higgins boats participated in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. American forces landed at 3 points along the North African coast, Casablanca in Morocco, and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The Higgins boats proved essential. Conventional landing craft would have struggled with the North African beaches and surf conditions, but the shallow-draft Higgins boats ran directly up onto the sand without difficulty. Troops charged down the ramps into water that was ankle-deep or dry, rather than wading through chest-deep surf. The boats reversed off and returned for more loads. Within 3 days, over 100,000 Allied troops and vast quantities of supplies were ashore at the 3 landing sites. Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the operation, sent Higgins a telegram on Thanksgiving Day 1942 that Higgins would treasure for the rest of his life. On this Thanksgiving Day, let us thank God for Higgins Industries' labour and management, which has given us landing boats with which to conduct our North African campaign. More power to you. Higgins had the telegram framed and hung it prominently in his office where visitors could see it. The success in North Africa vindicated the Higgins boat design completely and led to massive new orders from the military. By 1943, Higgins Industries was producing boats at a rate that seemed impossible to outside observers. At peak production, the 7 plants were churning out over 700 boats per month. The workers broke production records repeatedly, driving themselves to exhaustion. They worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly lines moved continuously. Plywood sides were cut to precise specifications, fitted and attached. Engines were installed and tested. Ramps were fabricated from steel plate and mounted with their mechanical lowering systems. Boats rolled off the lines and were immediately loaded onto rail cars for shipment to ports around the country and eventually around the world. The scale of production was staggering. By the end of 1943, Higgins Industries had produced over 12,000 boats of all types. Of these, the majority were LCVPs and their variants. The boats were being shipped to every theatre of the war. In the Pacific, they island-hopped with the Marines, landing troops on Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and dozens of other islands whose names would become synonymous with savage fighting. In Europe, they were accumulating in Britain for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but whose timing remained the most closely guarded secret of the war. The planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, began in earnest in 1943 under Eisenhower's command. He understood that the success of the invasion depended entirely on the ability to land massive numbers of troops and equipment on the French beaches. The beaches of Normandy had no ports. They were open stretches of sand backed by cliffs and defended by German fortifications that had been 2 years in the building. Landing troops there would require thousands of landing craft capable of crossing the English Channel in rough seas, approaching the beaches under heavy fire, and landing troops directly onto the sand under the worst possible conditions. The Higgins boat was the only craft that could do this reliably at scale. Allied planners calculated they would need over 5,000 landing craft for D-Day. Higgins Industries, along with other manufacturers building boats to Higgins' patented designs under license, was responsible for producing the majority of them. Chris Craft produced 8,602 LCVPs under license. Owens Yacht Company built 2,150. Richardson Boat Company produced 604. Combined with Higgins Industries' production of 12,500 LCVPs, the total reached 23,358 LCVPs by war's end. The pressure on production was immense. Workers at Higgins plants understood what they were building and why. When Higgins addressed them over the loudspeaker system, he did not mince words. These boats would carry American boys onto French beaches defended by German machine guns. Every boat had to be perfect. A single failure could mean dozens of deaths. The workers understood and responded. Production quality remained high, even as quantity increased dramatically. By early 1944, the staging areas in southern England were filled with Higgins boats. They sat in harbours, on beaches, in rivers, waiting for the order to load troops. Each boat was inspected multiple times, tested, and assigned to a specific unit. Crews trained endlessly, practicing loading troops from transport ships via cargo nets, beach runs in various sea states, and rapid unloading under simulated fire. Infantry practiced climbing down cargo nets into pitching boats while laden with 60 pounds of equipment, a terrifying experience in calm conditions and worse in rough seas. They practiced charging down the ramps and assaulting beach obstacles. Everyone knew the invasion was coming. They did not know when or where exactly, but they knew the Higgins boats would carry them there. The date was set for June 5, 1944, then postponed one day due to weather that threatened to capsize smaller landing craft. On the evening of June 5th, thousands of boats began loading troops from transport ships anchored off the English coast. The men climbed down rope cargo nets in full equipment, a dangerous operation even in calm seas. In the choppy conditions that evening, men lost their grip and fell into boats or between boats and ship hulls. Many were seasick before the boats even left the assembly areas. The channel crossing took hours in rough seas. The boats plunged through waves, water washing over the bows repeatedly, men bailing water with their helmets while trying not to vomit. Some boats leaked badly from the pounding. Men sat soaked to the skin, shivering, vomiting, certain they would die in the next few hours. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, over 5,000 ships of the Allied invasion fleet lay off the Normandy coast. Among them were hundreds of transport ships, and around these ships circled waves of Higgins boats loaded with troops waiting for the signal to head for shore. At Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing site, the first wave hit the shore at 6:30 in the morning. The boats ran up onto the sand, ramps dropped with metallic clangs, and men charged out into knee-deep water. German resistance at Utah was lighter than expected. The Higgins boats reversed off the beach successfully and returned to the transports. The operation proceeded almost according to plan, with 21,000 troops landing at the cost of 197 casualties, a remarkably low figure that testified to both good planning and some good fortune. At Omaha Beach, 15 miles to the east, the situation was catastrophic from the first moments. Omaha Beach was the most heavily defended of all the landing beaches. German forces of the 352nd Infantry Division, rather than the single regiment expected, occupied fortified positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. They had machine guns, mortars and artillery positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire beach. The pre-invasion naval bombardment, limited to 1 hour to preserve tactical surprise, had failed to destroy these defences. When the first wave of Higgins boats approached Omaha at 6:30, they ran into a storm of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. Many boats were hit before reaching the beach, their plywood sides offering no protection against machine gun fire. Others made it to the shore but landed directly in front of heavily defended sectors. The ramps dropped, and men charged out directly into machine gun fire sweeping the beach. The casualties in the first wave were horrific. Some units lost over 90% of their men within minutes. Company A of the 116th Regiment suffered 96% casualties, with nearly the entire company killed or wounded in the first 30 minutes. Bodies piled up on the ramps of boats, the weight preventing them from closing. Coxswains had to crawl over bodies to manually lift the ramps so boats could reverse off the beach. The boats that survived the first run returned to the transport ships, loaded more men, and went back in. They made run after run throughout the morning, each time facing the same devastating fire. One Higgins boat operator, in testimony given decades later, recalled making 15 trips to Omaha Beach that day. Each time he watched men charge down the ramp into fire. Each time the ramp became slippery with blood. Each time he brought back as many wounded and dead as he could carry using grappling hooks to pull bodies from the water. 6 Higgins boats from his ship were lost that day, but all crew members survived. 16 men pulled from the water and 2 making it to shore where they grabbed weapons and joined the fight. By the end of the day, approximately 2,400 Americans had been killed or wounded at Omaha Beach, the highest casualties of any landing beach on D-Day. The beach was littered with destroyed equipment, disabled vehicles and bodies. But the Higgins boats kept coming throughout the day. They brought reinforcements. They brought ammunition and supplies. They evacuated the wounded. By evening, American forces had established a tenuous foothold on Omaha despite the carnage. Across all 5 Normandy beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau and Sword, Higgins boats and other landing craft landed approximately 156,000 Allied troops on D-Day. The breakdown was 73,000 Americans and 83,115 British and Canadian forces. At Omaha alone, over 34,000 American troops came ashore despite the terrible casualties. Over the following weeks, the boats continued operations around the clock, ferrying men and supplies from ships to shore. Within a month, the Allies had landed over 850,000 troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies across the Normandy beaches. All of this was accomplished without capturing a single port. The Higgins boats, working in coordination with larger landing craft and amphibious equipment, had made it possible to build up overwhelming force faster than the Germans could reinforce their defences. Eisenhower's later assessment, given in 1964 during his first meeting with historian Stephen Ambrose at Eisenhower's office in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was not wartime hyperbole, but a carefully considered judgment made nearly 20 years after the war's end. When learning that Ambrose taught in New Orleans, Eisenhower asked if he had known Andrew Higgins, then said, "He's the man who won the war for us." If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built these landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. This was not a statement made in the heat of war, but a retrospective assessment after decades of reflection on what factors had enabled Allied victory. Without the Higgins boats, the entire Allied strategy would indeed have been fundamentally different. The Allies would have been forced to attempt capturing heavily defended ports before landing significant forces. Such operations would have been far more costly and might have failed entirely. In the Pacific theatre, Higgins boats were equally crucial to American strategy. The island-hopping campaign that drove across the Pacific toward Japan required amphibious assaults on dozens of islands, each one defended by Japanese forces who had been ordered to fight to the death. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines learned the brutal reality of opposed amphibious landings against determined defenders. The first waves landed in various Higgins landing craft and suffered terrible casualties crossing the reef and the beach under intense fire. But the boats kept coming, wave after wave, until Marines were ashore in sufficient numbers to overcome the Japanese defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The battle cost over 1,000 American dead and 2,000 wounded, but it established the template for future operations. At Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the same pattern repeated. Higgins boats would approach the beaches in waves, land troops under fire, reverse off and return for more. The Japanese defenders inflicted horrific casualties from fortified positions, but the Higgins boats kept delivering reinforcements until American forces prevailed. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, where 6,800 Americans died capturing an 8-square-mile island, Higgins boats landed 30,000 Marines in the first waves. At Okinawa in April 1945, the last major amphibious operation of the war, Higgins boats put 60,000 troops ashore on the first day. The boats even participated in the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany in March 1945, ferrying troops across under fire from German positions on the eastern bank, demonstrating their versatility beyond beach landings. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Higgins Industries and manufacturers building boats under license to Higgins patents had produced 23,358 LCVP landing craft. Higgins Industries itself produced 20,094 boats total during the war, including 12,500 LCVPs, 199 PT boats, various LCMs and LCTs, and other specialized craft. These boats had landed more Allied troops on hostile shores than all other methods combined. They had participated in every major amphibious operation of the war in both the European and Pacific theaters. Millions of Americans had ridden in Higgins boats at some point during their service. The boats had become so ubiquitous that soldiers and Marines did not speak of landing in LCVPS. They said they were going ashore in Higgins boats. The name had become synonymous with amphibious operations. Andrew Higgins himself became a national figure during the war. Life magazine featured him in a lengthy article in August 1943, describing his plants and his management style in detail that revealed both his genius and his abrasive personality. President Franklin Roosevelt visited the Higgins plant on September 29, 1942, during a secret nationwide tour of war production facilities. The visit was so highly classified that the Times-Picayune didn't report it until October 2nd, after Roosevelt had left New Orleans. Roosevelt toured the PT boat facility in a convertible automobile with Higgins, Louisiana Governor Sam Houston Jones, and Rear Admiral Frank T. Layton, the 8th Naval District Commandant. Higgins explained the company's role in the war effort using ship models while sitting in the automobile with the president. The visit was photographed, and the images appeared in newspapers across the country once the security blackout was lifted, making Higgins's face recognizable to millions of Americans. Higgins received numerous awards and commendations from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. He was recognized with the Army-Navy E Award multiple times, the highest commendation the armed forces could bestow on a civilian company for excellence in war production. His plants displayed the flags representing these awards prominently, and workers wore E-pins with pride, understanding that the award recognized their collective efforts. Higgins held approximately 30 patents related to landing craft and amphibious vehicles. His innovations in hull design, particularly the protected propeller tunnel and the spoon-shaped bow, were protected by U.S. Patent 2,144,111, filed on December 24, 1937, and issued on January 17, 1939. The bow ramp design was covered by U.S. Patent 2,341,866, filed on December 8, 1941, and issued on February 15, 1944. These patents represented the culmination of years of practical experience building boats for the Louisiana bayous, adapted brilliantly for military purposes through collaboration with Marine Corps officers like Victor Krulak, who recognized the value of Japanese innovations. Higgins' personality remained combative throughout the war. He fought constantly with the Navy's Bureau of Ships, who never forgave him for repeatedly demonstrating that a civilian with practical experience could out-design their engineers. He fought with unions when they attempted to organize his workers, viewing unions as obstacles to his direct relationship with employees and to maximum war production. He fought with competitors who he believed were receiving preferential treatment in contract awards. His vocabulary remained profane, his management style confrontational, and his confidence in his own abilities absolute. Workers either loved him or hated him, but virtually all respected him. He paid well, promoted based on merit regardless of race or gender, and demanded excellence from everyone including himself. His relationship with his workforce became increasingly complicated by union issues as the war progressed. Higgins opposed unions and said so openly and frequently, believing they interfered with his direct relationship with workers and with maximum production efficiency. When unions attempted to organize his plants, he resisted fiercely, sometimes in ways that violated federal labor law. This led to strikes and work stoppages that infuriated him. He saw unions as obstacles to war production and could not understand why workers would jeopardize the war effort over wages and working conditions that he believed were already generous by any reasonable standard. The conflict with unions would eventually contribute significantly to the downfall of Higgins Industries after the war ended and military contracts disappeared. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Navy began cancelling contracts for boats that were no longer needed for European operations. When Japan surrendered in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the cancellations accelerated dramatically. By October 11, 1945, all military contracts for boats had been terminated. Higgins Industries had built its entire operation around wartime production at maximum capacity. The company employed over 20,000 workers in 7 plants designed to produce boats at wartime rates. Suddenly, there were no more orders. Higgins attempted to transition to civilian production, building pleasure craft and developing consumer products. He tried to enter aircraft production, but his contracts for Curtiss C-76 Caravans and C-46 Commandos were cancelled before significant production began. Only 2 C-46A aircraft were completed before the contract was terminated on August 10, 1944. Higgins experimented with helicopter designs and built one prototype in 1946. He proposed building prefabricated housing and appliances for the post-war consumer boom. None of these ventures succeeded in replacing the massive wartime revenues. Union troubles intensified as workers who had tolerated wartime conditions now demanded higher wages and better working conditions in peacetime. Higgins, who had been unable to understand union demands during the war when victory was at stake, was even less sympathetic afterward. In early June 1945, he announced that approximately 1,500 workers at his City Park plant would be laid off as orders declined. In mid-August, with most military contracts cancelled, he announced that cancelling the remaining $20 million in military contracts meant 2/3 of employees would be laid off. In late October, he announced he would close all remaining plants in New Orleans and reopen under a new business organization where workers would not have to pay tribute to anybody to obtain employment, meaning they would not have to join unions or pay union dues. On November 9, 1945, Andrew Higgins liquidated Higgins Industries. The company that had employed 25,000 workers at peak production and produced over 20,000 boats was shut down. In January 1946, Higgins formed a new company, Higgins Incorporated, to build pleasure boats and continue some limited commercial production. His brother Frank became director of marketing, operating Higgins Marine Sales Corporation. But the magic was gone. By 1948, all but one plant had closed, with watercraft production concentrated in the industrial canal plant. Mounting debts accumulated as the company struggled to find its place in the peacetime economy. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at the age of 65. He had been hospitalized for approximately 1 week with stomach ulcers before suffering a fatal stroke. His death came just 7 years after the war ended, at a time when his company was struggling and his personal fortune largely depleted. His sons, Ed, Andrew Jr., Frank and Roland, attempted to continue the business through the 1950s, but mounting debts proved insurmountable. In 1959, 7 years after Andrew Higgins's death, the company was sold to New York Ship. One of the Higgins factories in New Orleans was converted into NASA's Michoud Assembly Facility in 1961, where it would produce Saturn V rocket stages and space shuttle external tanks. The legacy of Andrew Higgins and his boats endured far beyond his company's failure. The Higgins boat enabled a form of warfare that the Axis powers could not effectively counter. The Germans fortified the ports along the Atlantic Wall, concentrating their strongest defences at locations they believed the Allies would be forced to attack. The Allies simply landed on the beaches between the fortified ports, using Higgins boats to put troops ashore where the defences were weakest. In the Pacific, the Japanese fortified their island bases around harbours and airfields. The Americans landed Marines on coral beaches away from the main defences, using Higgins boats to establish beachheads that expanded faster than counterattacks could eliminate them. The strategic impact was profound. It enabled the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, the invasions of North Africa and Italy, the Normandy landings, and the advance into Germany. Every major Allied amphibious operation depended on Higgins boats to land the assault troops. The simplicity of the design was deceptive and part of its genius. The spoon-shaped bow that could ride up onto obstacles, the protected propeller that allowed beaching and reversing without fouling, the planning hull that provided speed and manoeuvrability, the steel ramp that allowed troops to charge directly onto beaches. Each element solved a specific problem. Together, they created a craft that could land troops on a hostile beach, reverse off cleanly, and return for more, repeatedly, under fire, in all conditions. The boat succeeded on coral atolls in the Pacific, sandy beaches in North Africa, and the pebble beaches of Normandy. It succeeded because Andrew Higgins understood boats at a fundamental level. He understood them because he had built them for years to solve practical problems in harsh conditions. When the military needed boats for the harshest conditions imaginable, Higgins already had the solution. His Eureka boat, designed for Louisiana bayous, contained all the essential features. The addition of the bow ramp completed it. The statistics tell the story clearly. Total LCVP production, 23,358 boats. Higgins Industries production, 20,094 boats, including 12,500 LCVPs. Allied troops landed on D-Day, 156,000. American troops at Omaha Beach, 34,000. All accomplished without capturing a single port, using beaches that military planners had considered unsuitable for major operations. The impact on the war was incalculable. Lives were saved because troops could charge down a ramp instead of climbing over sides under fire. Operations succeeded that would have failed with conventional landing craft. Victories were won faster because Higgins boats could build up forces ashore more rapidly than enemies could respond. In 2000, a 7-block section of Howard Avenue in New Orleans near the National WWII Museum was renamed Andrew Higgins Drive. In 2001, a memorial to Higgins was dedicated in his hometown of Columbus, Nebraska. In May 2019, Andrew Higgins was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. The National WWII Museum in New Orleans features Higgins boats prominently, the museum's location chosen specifically because the city was home to Higgins Industries. Restored Higgins boats are displayed at museums across the country. The boats have become iconic symbols of American industrial might and ingenuity during World War II, representing the ability to solve problems quickly and produce solutions at scale. The integrated workforce legacy of Higgins Industries, where black and white workers laboured side by side at equal pay, demonstrated that racial segregation was not necessary for industrial efficiency, a lesson that would become relevant during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Nevertheless, the example demonstrated that integrated workforces could be highly productive. Black workers and white workers labouring side by side, earning equal pay for equal work, proved that racial segregation was not necessary for industrial efficiency, a lesson that would become relevant during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The story of the Higgins boat demonstrates the value of practical experience over theoretical expertise. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, staffed with trained engineers, could not design an effective landing craft in 20 years. Higgins, who learned boat design through trial and error, solved the problem in months. The difference was that Higgins built boats to solve real problems under harsh conditions. When the military needed boats for the harshest conditions possible, his practical experience proved more valuable than formal training. The Higgins boat showed that civilians with specialized knowledge could solve military problems faster than military bureaucracies. This realization profoundly influenced military procurement for decades. Today, a restored Higgins boat sits outside the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. Visitors can see the plywood construction, the protected propeller tunnel, the steel bow ramp. The boat looks small and unremarkable. It is difficult to imagine this craft crossing the English Channel in rough seas and landing soldiers on Normandy beaches under fire. But that is exactly what thousands of these boats accomplished, day after day, until victory was achieved. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at age 65, his company defunct and his fortune depleted. He is buried at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans, but his boats had carried millions of Americans into combat and brought victory to the Allied cause. Dwight Eisenhower's assessment, made in 1964 after nearly 2 decades of reflection, stands as the final word. He's the man who won the war for us. If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built these landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. The plywood ramp won the war by enabling operations that would have been impossible without it.